Smoke was still rising when the green caught our eye. Every ridge, every slope for kilometres, ash and standing char. But along one creek bend, willows still held their leaves. The water was still moving. Hydrologist Emily Fairfax had been tracking this pattern across the western United States for years. Beaver-dammed corridors, surviving fires that consumed everything beside them. What a small animal builds quietly over 20 summers. The fire simply went around. The creek bottom sat 3 to 4 times wider than the water itself. A wet corridor holding every colour the ridgelines had just lost. Deer stood inside it. Songbirds crowded the willows. The flames had swept within metres of that edge and stopped. When a wildfire moves fast and dry, it reads the land. It follows the moisture. Or rather, it follows the absence of it. Mineral soil with no root mass burns clean. Hydrologist Emily Fairfax mapped burned and unburned zones across the western United States, publishing her findings in 2020. What she found in the satellite imagery was not a firebreak humans had cut. It was the outline of a beaver pond complex. Beaver ponds raise the water table around them. That moisture moves laterally through the soil, out beyond the bank, into the roots of every shrub within reach. The ground simply holds too much water to ignite. Fairfax's study covered 5 wildfires across the American West. In every single case, the beaver-dammed corridors remained largely unburned while the surrounding landscape was consumed. The animal responsible weighs 20 kilograms. It does not plan ahead in any way we would recognize. It builds because water moves, and moving water is a problem a beaver cannot leave alone. Meanwhile, federal fire suppression programs across the West had spent decades and billions of dollars in aerial retardant drops, and the green strip outlasted all of it. The suppression lines held where the beavers had worked longest. No permit, no budget, no crew. A 20-kilogram animal piling sticks in a creek for years before the fire season anyone remembers, built the most effective firebreak in the valley. But Fairfax's maps showed something the acreage numbers alone could not explain. The corridors that survived best were not simply the wettest, they were the oldest. The ones where beavers had been working longest held moisture deepest. The mechanism behind that difference is not obvious. The surface lies to you. Late summer, a western creek valley looks composed, willows grey at the tips but upright, the channel visible, the banks intact. Nothing announces the collapse happening 2 meters below your boots. When dams are absent, a stream does not stay level. It cuts. Gradient builds, the channel deepens, and the surrounding soil drains into the incised bed like a slow hemorrhage. The floodplain does not flood anymore, it desiccates. Fairfax's satellite analysis mapped that drainage from orbit. The geography of what she found should sit with you for a moment, because it did not look like drought. It looked like a system that had quietly unplugged itself from its own water supply. In the East Fork of the Salmon River corridor in Idaho, vegetation greenness inside active dam complexes outpaced the surrounding burn scar by a margin visible in NDVI satellite reading. The most exposed strip in the scar was the only surviving green. Along Colorado's North Fork drainage, reaches without dam activity showed fine fuels curing to critical dryness weeks ahead of ponded reaches nearby. In Nevada's Great Basin drainages, channel incision had cut beds below the old floodplain surface, leaving riparian roots effectively stranded above the moving water. Across Oregon's eastern high desert, intermittent streams that had held surface flow through drought years within living memory, went dry months earlier each decade, narrowing the surviving green until almost nothing remained to meet a flame front. That incision number is the one that stops me. A channel sitting below its old bed is not a stream in trouble. It is a drain. The roots above it are reaching for moisture that has already passed underneath them and moved on. The willows still stand. The channel is still visible. But the moisture the plants depend on has dropped below the root zone, and the landscape has already crossed a threshold it does not advertise. Fairfax's study covered 5 wildfires spread across the American West, and in every case, dam-built corridors measured 3 to 4 times wider than the stream itself remained largely unburned. The land that burned and the land that did not share the same rainfall, the same aspect, the same elevation. The only variable that consistently separated them was time. How long the engineering had been running beneath the surface. That last detail is the one the acreage figures alone cannot carry. Older complexes held moisture deeper in the soil profile than younger ones, even when both had surface ponding visible from orbit. Something about duration, about years of incremental re-wetting, was doing work that a single season of ponding could not replicate. The mechanism that explains exactly how deep that moisture travels and how many seasons it takes to become truly fire-resistant remains unresolved in the published record. A stream that carries water is not the same thing as a stream that owns its floodplain. That difference, invisible from the road, invisible from the air, unless you know the NDVI signature to look for, is exactly the margin between land that ignites and land that does not. The valley looked like it was holding on. It was not. And the next fire season would not wait for the roots to find their way back down. Fire crews scraped those hillsides clean. Blade after blade, the dozers cut fuel breaks across slopes that had never seen bare mineral soil, and the people driving them worked through the night in conditions that would stop most of us cold. Those were not reckless choices. The managers running those operations had real tools, real deadlines, and a flame front that does not negotiate. The calculus made sense until you tallied what it cost and what it left behind. Bulldozed fuel breaks regularly ran past $2,000 per acre. Scraped once, exposed to weather, and dry again by August. The corridor a beaver colony builds costs nothing to install and rebuilds itself every season. Aerial slurry arrived at roughly $500 per gallon delivered. It slowed fire where it landed, and then it rained, washing into the creek bottoms with documented toxicity to amphibians and invertebrates that had survived centuries of drought and flame. Hand crews cut line at $1,000 or more per acre through terrain where the flame front could outrun a person inside of minutes. They held where fire behavior cooperated. Where it did not, the line held nothing. Not one of those interventions touched the 3 things that actually determine whether a riparian corridor ignites: the depth of saturated soil, the reconnection of the surrounding terrain to the water moving through it, and the slow pre-loading of organic material with enough stored moisture to refuse combustion. A colony of 6 to 8 beavers moves roughly half a ton of material per month. It does all 3 of those things simultaneously, continuously, and without a budget line, and it gets more effective the longer it is left alone. Through the 1990s and deep into the 2000s, wildlife managers across several western states blocked reintroduction proposals. Flooded fields, damaged irrigation infrastructure, blocked fish passage. Every objection was real, every conflict genuinely documented. Nobody invented the problem to slow things down, but those resistance calculations carried no line item for the one value that dwarfs all the others combined: a saturated Riparian corridor 3 to 4 times wider than the open water itself, holding 4 meters of wet soil ahead of an advancing fire front, was worth something. Nobody had measured it yet. Emily Fairfax, a hydrologist at the University of Colorado, put that number into the published record in 2020. Across 5 wildfires in the American West, every beaver-dammed corridor she mapped came through largely unburned, while the surrounding terrain was consumed. The oldest corridors, where beavers had worked the longest, held their ground best of all. That pattern is not accidental. It means the fire protection the beaver builds is not static, it compounds. Every undisturbed season the margin widens. What we spent decades trying to build with blades and slurry, 6 animals were already constructing for free underground before the smoke ever rose. The dam goes in quietly, a knee-high structure of willow branches and packed mud, nothing dramatic about it. Water backs up behind it within hours, and within days it stops moving downstream the way water is supposed to move. Instead, it migrates sideways. It pushes laterally into the soil, wicking outward across the floodplain bench, not just at the bank's edge, but more in either direction, saturating ground that had been dry for years. Willows and sedges root into that soaked zone and stay green through the drought months. Everything beyond that saturated margin cures to tinder. The contrast, standing at the valley edge in late summer, is almost violent. A second dam goes in downstream, then a third. Each one steps the water table further up the gradient, each one extending the saturated bench outward into what was previously just dry ground. The engineering is additive. It compounds with every undisturbed season. By the time a smoke column rises on the ridge above, the valley floor has already been altered. The thermal infrared data Fairfax collected showed soil moisture in these ponded zones remaining measurably elevated during active burning on the surrounding slopes. The intensity drops. The rate of spread slows. What had been an advancing wall of combustion loses its footing on saturated soil. The valley doesn't resist the burn, it simply has nothing left to offer it. Aquatic invertebrates return to standing water within a single growing season. Dragonflies follow. The beetles that need saturated margins reappear. Then the birds that track invertebrate populations arrive. Within seasons of ponding, the valley is already loud again, deer, elk and bears, displaced by the burn press into the green strip and concentrate there. Browse lines appear on the willows within weeks, visible proof of the density written into the vegetation itself. The refuge, built for one species, absorbs the survivors of others simultaneously. What nobody predicted, and what the field data keeps confirming, is that the oldest, most established ponded corridors recover the surrounding hillside faster than newly burned zones with no wet anchor nearby. The moisture the ponds hold doesn't stay in the valley. It moves upslope as vapour, moderating soil temperature on the adjacent slopes during the critical regrowth window. The dam was never a fire break. It was a water table. And a high water table, it turns out, is the oldest and most persistent form of fire resistance this landscape has ever produced. Built incrementally, maintained for free, and never requiring a refill. The model held until the animals pushed past it. Fairfax's 2020 study was built on corridors where beaver activity was already established, mapped, measured, satellite confirmed. What nobody fully budgeted for was what came next. After the reintroductions that Fairfax's findings helped justify, field teams began finding colonies in reaches that seasonal flow maps had classified as too intermittent, too steep, or too degraded to hold standing water past May. The animals had not read the hydrological surveys. In some drainages, colonies placed into lower gradient reaches worked their way upstream into tributary channels across a single winter. By the following spring, they had built dam complexes in spots that every prior assessment said could not sustain ponding. In at least one documented case inside a Colorado drainage, a colony established itself on private land without the landowner's knowledge and had inundated 12 acres of productive hay ground before the conflict ever reached a wildlife manager's desk. Ranchers in Riparian meadows found fence lines under spring runoff before any ground crew could respond. Irrigation ditch intakes that had run without obstruction for generations were suddenly managing overflow from ponds that had not existed the previous autumn. These are real losses, not inconveniences. They are economic injuries carried by people who never enrolled in a restoration program. The animal does not negotiate. It builds to its own specification on its own timeline, and it does not file a notice of intent. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The same corridor that is 3 to 4 times wider than the stream it follows, the one Fairfax showed surviving fire after fire, is also the corridor generating the most administrative conflict per linear kilometre of any habitat-type land managers currently deal with. The ground that the beaver leaves behind is simultaneously the most fire-resistant land in the entire watershed and the most administratively tangled. No program designed that paradox. The animal built it anyway, one dam at a time, one winter at a time. Across 5 wildfires studied, the corridors held. But the territory expanding beyond those original studied reaches is now outpacing the agreements, the permits, and the compensation frameworks built to manage it. The question land managers are now sitting with is not whether beaver-built corridors reduce fire damage. That data is settled. The question is who absorbs the cost when the engineer builds somewhere nobody authorised and the green ground that results belongs to a watershed but floods a neighbour's field. Who absorbs the cost? That question will outlast this generation of managers. But underneath it, quieter and older than any permit, the physics has already declared its answer. Emily Fairfax's 2020 data, when you strip it to its simplest physical law, says this: saturated ground does not burn. That is not a policy recommendation, it is hydrology. The animal that saturates ground was already here, already working, before the first fire management agency ever held a meeting or printed a suppression plan. That precedence matters more than people admit. Across the 5 wildfires Fairfax studied, the dammed corridors measured 3 to 4 times wider than the water channel itself, and that extra width is exactly where the surviving vegetation stood when the smoke cleared. The oldest complexes, where the engineering had run longest, held moisture deepest into the dry season. Not because nature performed a miracle, because deep soil water does not evaporate on the same schedule shallow surface water does. 2 decades after grey wolves returned to the northern Rockies, riparian willows along creek banks that had been eroding for 70 years began to stabilise. The livestock lobby fought the reintroduction hard through the late 1990s. The creek kept running regardless. Monitoring data accumulated across those 2 decades still cannot close the ratio. How much of that bank recovery came from reduced grazing pressure driven by predator fear? And how much was simply time and water doing what they always do when left alone? The creek does not know the difference. It just runs cleaner than it did. Recovery is not a policy. It is what water does when you give it somewhere to stay. Drop your region and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime into the comments. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. Next, grey wolves across the northern Rockies pushed elk off creek banks. And within 20 years, stream channel stability measurements in Yellowstone's Lamar Valley shifted in ways that took researchers by surprise. The US Fish and Wildlife Service fought delisting battles through 2011, blocking the monitoring frameworks that would have caught the effect sooner. The open question that footage still cannot answer, whether the willows came back because the wolves arrived, or because the wolves made the elk afraid to stay.